Welcome to Echo No More, clear, credible, court-ready documentation in high-conflict parenting. No hype, no legal jargon, no drama. I'm Dr. James. If you're new here, I'm really glad you found this space. This podcast is for protective parents navigating high-conflict custody situations, especially when the other parent is manipulative, emotionally unsafe, or unpredictable. I'm not a lawyer, and this podcast isn't legal advice. What I am is a parent who has lived through this system, and someone whose attorneys over and over again told me the same thing. Your documentation is excellent. They told me it made their job easier. They told me it protected my credibility, and they told me it changed how my case was received. That's why I'm sharing this. Not to teach you how to fight, but how to document calmly, clearly, and in a way courts actually understand. This is parent to parent, calm, grounded, and focused on protecting your child without losing yourself.
Welcome back to the Court Documentation Podcast. I'm Dr. Carolina James, and today I want to talk about something that changed the way I documented forever. What professionals actually notice and what they often skip. Because if you're anything like I was at the beginning of my documentation journey, you're probably spending an enormous amount of energy trying to make sure nothing gets missed. You save everything, you document everything, you explain everything, and honestly, I understand why. When you're living inside uncertainty, every detail feels important. I remember sitting at my computer late at night after my son had gone to bed. I would reread emails, rewrite incident logs, add more context, add more explanations, add more details, because I was terrified that if I didn't explain things perfectly, nobody would understand what was happening. Maybe you felt that way too. Maybe you thought, if I can just explain this one more time, if I can just provide a little more context, if I can just help them see what I see, then they'll finally understand. What I eventually learned was both frustrating and liberating. Professionals do not read documentation the way parents imagine they do, not because they don't care, because they can't. Judges, guardians ad litem, evaluators, attorneys, therapists, school administrators, they all operate under significant time constraints. They are reviewing information from multiple sources. They are making decisions. They are identifying patterns. They are solving problems. And because of that, they read differently than we expect them to. One of the biggest mistakes I made early on was assuming that professionals started with content. They don't. They start with orientation. Before they absorb a single fact, they are unconsciously asking themselves a few questions. Can I understand this quickly? Does this seem reliable? How difficult is this going to be to navigate? Those questions get answered within minutes, sometimes within seconds. And that's why structure matters so much. I think parents often assume professionals care most about the information itself. The reality is that the presentation of information affects whether the information gets absorbed. Think about your own life. If someone hands you a well-organized report and someone else hands you a stack of loose papers, your experience is immediately different. The content may be identical, but your willingness to engage changes. Professionals are no different. One thing I learned after years of documentation is that structure creates trust before content even has a chance to. Clear dates, consistent formatting, logical organization, summaries, headings, simple systems. These things communicate something important. They tell the reader, you don't have to work hard to understand this. And that's a gift. because professionals are already working hard enough. The second thing professionals noticed, and honestly, this surprised me when I first understood it, is tone. Not because they're evaluating your personality, but because they're evaluating reliability. I often tell parents that documentation has a nervous system. You can feel it when you read it. Some documentation feels calm, grounded, organized. Other documentation feels frantic, urgent, overwhelmed. Professionals feel that immediately. And here's something important. The seriousness of your concerns does not require an intense tone. In fact, some of the strongest documentation I've ever seen was incredibly calm. I had to learn this myself, especially in the beginning, because when you're scared, frustrated, angry, or exhausted, your documentation naturally wants to carry those emotions. But documentation becomes stronger when it separates facts from feelings. That doesn't mean your emotions aren't valid. Of course they are. I've cried over documentation. I've been angry while documenting. I've been heartbroken while documenting. But those emotions belonged in conversations with trusted people, not in the records themselves. The records had a different job. The records needed to be clear. The third thing professionals notice is selectivity. This one is hard because most parents are terrified of leaving something out. I certainly was. I thought documenting more meant documenting better. What I eventually learned was that documenting everything can sometimes make it harder to identify what truly matters. Professionals notice very quickly whether a parent has thresholds. In other words, what does it take for this parent to document something? When every irritation becomes an entry, professionals have a harder time identifying significance. When documentation is selective, they begin to trust the parent's judgment. Not because the parent is right, but because the parent appears discerning. And discernment matters. One thing that completely changed my own approach was realizing that professionals are primarily looking for patterns, not incidents, patterns. I know that's hard to hear because many parents can identify specific moments that changed everything, specific incidents that felt enormous, specific events that still hurt. But professionals often ask a different question. Was this isolated? Or is this recurring? They are looking for frequency, consistency, trajectory. Because patterns are what help professionals predict future outcomes, not individual moments. Now, let's talk about what professionals often skip. And I know this part can be painful, because many of the things professionals skip are the things parents spend the most time creating. Long explanations, repeated justifications, speculation about motives, character assessments, emotional narratives. Not because professionals don't care, because those things rarely help them answer the questions they're trying to answer. One of the most freeing lessons I learned was this. Professionals are not trying to determine who the villain is. They are trying to determine what is happening. That's a completely different task. The more documentation focuses on behavior and outcomes, the easier it becomes for professionals to use. Another thing professionals often skip is repetition. Parents frequently think, if I say it again, they'll understand how important it is. Professionals often experience the opposite. Once they've understood a point, repetition doesn't deepen understanding. It reduces attention. That's why summaries are so powerful. A summary doesn't repeat information, it organizes it. Those are very different things. Another thing that surprised me was how much professionals respect uncertainty. Parents often believe they need certainty to sound credible. Actually, the opposite is often true. Some of the strongest statements sound like this. The outcome remains unclear. This pattern appears to be emerging. This concern has not yet resolved. Professionals trust that language because it acknowledges reality. Reality is often messy, incomplete, and uncertain. Documentation that respects complexity often feels more trustworthy. One thing I've noticed throughout my own journey is that the strongest documentation rarely feels dramatic. It feels obvious. When professionals finish reading it, they don't feel persuaded. They feel informed. And that's exactly what we are aiming for. Before we finish, I want to address something I hear constantly from parents. They're afraid professionals will miss the most important thing, the thing that keeps them awake at night, the thing that motivated all the documentation in the first place. I understand that fear. I've had that fear. But here's what I've learned. If something truly matters, it won't exist in only one place. It will show up repeatedly. It will appear in patterns. It will appear in summaries. It will appear in outcomes. It will appear across systems. School, medical, therapy, communication, behavior. Important things leave footprints. And documentation helps those footprints become visible. You do not need professionals to read every word. You need them to see the shape of the situation. And shape is created through structure, tone, consistency, and restraint, not volume. This week's action step is simple. Take one piece of documentation you've written recently. Read it as though you're a professional seeing it for the first time. Ask yourself, what's the first thing I notice? Is it the information or is it the emotion? Is it the pattern or is it the explanation? Then make one small change that improves clarity. Because every improvement in clarity increases the likelihood that what matters most will be seen. Thank you for joining me for another episode of the Court Documentation Podcast. Until next time, remember, professionals don't trust documentation because it's long. They trust documentation because it's clear.
Before we close, I want to remind you of something important. You don't need to document everything. You don't need to be perfect. And you don't need to convince anyone with emotion. Calm documentation is power. If this episode helped you, you will find a full structured system in my guide, Clear, Credible, Court Ready. It's designed to support, not replace, your attorney. And if you want help turning everything you're documenting into something organized and usable, you can visit www.economocoaching.org to download my guide on how to create a clear, court-ready documentation binder. Take what helps, leave what doesn't, and most of all, take care of yourself. I'll see you next week.